Great to have you back. In part 4, I'll look at ways that a strong theoretical framework aids you in your research and analysis of data. 2, we'll look at the essentials of what social theory does. 3, I'll take you through a specific investigation and how research questions change across two sociological schools and theoretical frameworks. 4, I'll take you through a step-by-step process for constructing a theoretical framework. All right, let's turn our attention to what constitutes a theoretical framework. The term theoretical framework often sends a chill down the spine of doctoral students, even some seasoned scholars. Look at these students, a bit overreactive, I think. But why? Because the concept of theory and the term theoretical signals big complicated ideas from thinkers like Foucault, Pierre Bourdieu, Marx, Max Weber, Judith Butler, Patricia Hill Collins, Claudia Anzalúa, and many others. No doubt, this seminal work needs to be read throughout one's career. I truly believe that young and mid-career scholars should read as much theory as they can. I must confess that when I'm asked to review a manuscript, I can tell whether the author is comfortable with theory. But it can feel overwhelming if you wrongly assume that you need to master theoretical works before you can conduct valuable research and share it with scholars in your field. Instead, you draw on the research literature and on the relevant theories that will enable you to pursue questions and issues that you're passionate about. And you consolidate this literature and these relevant theories into your theoretical framework. A theoretical framework is best understood in terms of discovery, emergence, guidance, and as an analytical lens. It is not a nit, but a process. The theoretical framework consists of the selected theory or theories drawn from a study of the literature and used to guide your research. The framework you construct is about putting the theory and theoretical ideas at your service. In a sense, you are the chief astronomer, and together with a talented team of scientists, you build a state-of-the-art telescope, and you marshal all the relevant research and theories. The theory you select and your constructed theoretical framework, it provides you with a powerful instrument for looking into the stars. But instead of looking into the cosmos, you are looking into a community, an organization, or an institution. Let's list here 6 ways that a strong theoretical framework aids us in our research and analysis of data. 1. Provides a lens for interpretation. Together, the theory and framework suggests what to look for in the data and how to interpret patterns. 2. Links data to existing knowledge. A researcher's theoretical framework connects the researcher's findings to broader scholarly conversations in the field or discipline. If you are studying social inequality, you can decide whether to situate your data and analyses within Marxist theory or within the realm of critical race theory. 3. Guides coding and categorization. Especially in qualitative research, the framework informs how themes and codes are developed. For instance, the use of feminist theory might lead a researcher to focus on power dynamics, gender language, or representations of agency in the data. 4. Shapes explanation and meaning making. A well-developed theoretical framework provides concepts and vocabulary that help transform raw data into explanations rather than just descriptions. Instead of saying that upper middle class students at one high school have more college educated adults in their network compared to working class students at another school, your use of social capital theory as well as a selective theory of social inequality, both theories transform your findings into sociological insight. Let me read the following and you can follow. Upper middle class students are embedded within a school, family, and community network that act as a form of capital. Let's put this in different words. These young people rely on their family's economic capital, social capital, and cultural capital to ensure their placement in elite schools, to ensure their access to resource-rich extracurricular activities and elite travel experiences that together lead to prestigious universities and high-status occupations. This is one important way that social class inequality is perpetuated and reproduced across generations. This broadens the idea of generational wealth. 5. Ensures coherence and consistency. A theoretical framework creates a logical thread from research questions to data collection to analysis and then finally conclusions. 6. Enables critique and reflection. Lastly, the framework allows the researcher to critically examine assumptions and biases, both in the data and in their own interpretations. For example, a critical race theory perspective might prompt questions about whose voices are centered or marginalized. Overall, the theoretical framework is the bridge between data and theory, turning raw observations into meaningful insights and ensuring that findings contribute to cumulative knowledge in the field. The heart and soul of your immersion theoretical framework is the theory or theories you select for your study. One problem we have is that theory is defined in so many ways. Well, it could be downright bewildering to many. Indeed, the sociologist Gabriel Abad writes that there are at least 7 distinct uses of the word. We're not going to review them here. I just want you to know that everyone is bewildered by the task of defining theory, so you are not alone. We can try to demystify theory by being curious. Think of the many branches of a tall pine tree and imagine a rambunctious child climbing from branch to branch. No matter what branch the child climbs onto, they're on the tree. Let's begin here with one way social theory can be described or broadly defined. Social theory is a set of ideas that helps us explain, interpret, and understand social life, how people relate to one another, and how society is organized, how society changes and holds together. And yet, to really qualify as legitimate theory, these sets of ideas are integrated into a well-developed explanatory framework based on accumulated evidence and open to review and critique by a community of social scientists. Years ago, when I tried to explain to my undergraduate students why social scientists needed theory and all that specialized elitist jargon, I told them, we do not make sense of reality directly. Rather, we make sense of reality through a particular discourse or language. Sociology is a particular specialized discourse. We can't see and make sense of the layers of earth beneath us without the tools and specialized language of geologists. We can't really see and understand the distant stars of our galaxy without the high-powered telescopes and the specialized discourse of astronomers. This video tutorial, in a short time that we have, cannot prepare anyone to fully understand all the kinds and categories of theories that exist in the social science universe. Yet, I can spell out some of the major and very important distinctions. I do want to encourage all early career scholars to demystify and become familiar with theories across epistemological and ontological categories. For the moment, let's say that social theory provides two main things. First, it proposes causes, mechanisms, or processes that account for social phenomena. For example, why social inequality persists despite economic growth. Second, it gives meaning to human action and social interaction. For example, understanding how people construct identities. Now, having made this distinction, it's often the case that many people always think of theories as formal attempts to explain causality, meaning how X causes Y, with such explanations having been tested across different contexts and now grounded in empirical evidence. Now, while many theories do attempt to explain causality, other theories launched in different traditions are not concerned with causality. The tradition of interpretive sociology, as just shown, focuses on meaning, identity, and understanding. It explains action by showing how actors interpret situations and how meaning is created through social interaction. There is the Weberian tradition based on the work of Max Weber, symbolic interactionism of George Herbert Mead, phenomenological sociology from the work of Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman, and ethnomethodology attributed to the work of Harold Garfinkel. Let's use an example of a sociological study that looks at an important issue through the prism of two sociological schools or traditions. You might want to know how certain people and groups in society have an advantage in getting quick access to valuable institutional resources, information, privileges, political favors, and career opportunities. And you want to explore how theories of social capital can account for how gender helps determine how people become embedded in resource-rich networks and how many others find themselves in resource-poor networks. So here you are, a doctoral student or a career scholar, and you want to investigate whether highly competent women married with small children fare in the labor market when compared to comparable married men with children. Okay, you decide to begin by using theories of social capital in your research. These theories zero in on how social networks and access to privileged resources operates across many different settings and situations across society. These theories alert you to how access to opportunities occurs through engagement with gatekeepers and institutional agents. The sociological term for this is brokerage. In your study, you find that social capital theory shifts the question from how competent is the worker to who is willing to vouch for and advocate for this worker. Now, survey studies tell us that most people find jobs through their personal network, people they know and who they can turn to for help. From the existing research using social capital theory, we see that opportunities in labor markets often flow through informal networks, recommendations, and sponsorship. You've heard it many times. It's about who you know and who can open doors for you. Thus, highly competent women with children often experience reduced participation in informal socialization. For example, after-hours events. There are other similar factors. The issue here is, regardless of a woman's considerable talent, she may not be able to engage in the same kind of networking as women with no children. Now you might say the situation could also affect highly competent men with children. I'd say that's an important question that needs to be studied. Now let's say that you decide to do a follow-up study, but this time you want to look at job interviews across two situations. In the first, HR male personnel interview both highly competent male and female prospective job candidates, both groups with children. In the second, HR female personnel interview with both groups. Let's say, for the sake of this example, you find that male candidates are significantly more likely to get hired by male HR personnel. So you turn to interpretive sociology, which begins with the premise that social action is guided by the meanings actors attach to situations and to people. In the case here, you want to explore how male HR personnel interpret competence, commitment, and job suitability, and how female HR personnel do the same. Could it be that male HR people view women candidates with children as having too many other commitments, and that male candidates are able to put child responsibilities on the back burner? Or perhaps they can ask their wives to handle this responsibility. The point here in this study is that interpretive sociology would lead us to explore the distinct meanings and criteria that male and female HR personnel might have when they make judgments about competence and talent, and about commitment to career. In a moment, I'll mention how status characteristics theory provides us with a detailed explanation of how gender ideologies shape how competence, authority, and suitability are interpreted, often unconsciously by those in powerful gatekeeping positions. Both causal-oriented theory and interpretive theory bring something valuable to the study of the experiences of parents in the labor market. Social theories often are seen as fitting in to one of three levels or classes. This is done because theories vary in scope depending on the scale of the issues they're meant to address. So the three classes are micro-level theories, meso-level theories, and macro-level or grand theories. Micro-level theories typically focus on the individual in their social setting, or a small group of individuals in a particular social context. Meso-level theories usually focus on a community or an organization, and macro-level or grand theories attempt to explain large-scale relationships in society, such as class and race and gender. They attempt to answer fundamental questions such as why societies form and why they change. Let's go back to my earlier example about how different theories used together can help us understand how gender determines how people become embedded in resource-rich networks. Now, for the micro level, we can turn to Joseph Berger's status characteristics theory. When applied to this issue, we see that in job interviews, there exist widely shared cultural beliefs about how gender influences perception of job competence and commitment. More specifically, how gender ideology shapes how competence, authority, and suitability are interpreted, often unconsciously by those in powerful gatekeeping positions. Among male hiring managers, there is the potential for male candidates to be seen as more competent and committed. Women, as generally, or I should say, women are generally presumed to be less authoritative and less job focused. In contrast, at the meso level, social capital theory helps us see how opportunities in labor markets often flow through informal networks, through recommendations and brokerage, and that women can be excluded from those informal networks that have special connections to gatekeepers that oversee hiring. Let me briefly name another class of theories, particularly because you've heard of them quite often. These are typically called grand theories. They ask very large questions such as, how is society organized by patriarchy? Which we can define as a social system in which men hold primary power and dominate roles in political leadership, where men hold moral authority and merit social privilege. Grand theories enable us to address things like power, forms of domination, or how resources are distributed unequally in society. They guide what researchers think is important and influence how evidence is interpreted. Examples of such theories are Marxism, social reproduction and conflict theory, critical race theory, and feminist theory. Such theoretical frameworks give meaning to what's observed by social scientists. Finally, let me address how the term theory is often used in everyday language and in different ways by scholars. People often use the word theory to mean a reasonable possibility or speculation about why something happened. What people sometimes mean when they say my theory is closer to a hypothesis, interpretation, or speculative explanation. Sometimes what you hear is, well, my theory is that, etc. The first thing you ask is whether the person has any empirical evidence. If there is, then we can say that there is some substance or validity to their hypothesis. If it is merely an opinion and no real evidence, then when they say, well, my theory is, you know the word theory is being used in a colloquial sense. In other words, it is an opinion. Okay, someone might say, my theory is that students did poorly because the test was unfair. Again, you ask, what is your evidence? If there is some meaningful evidence, then theory becomes a worthy hypothesis. If there is no significant evidence, then theory, again, is merely opinion. Then, of course, there are conspiracy theories, which has nothing to do with social science. Sometimes it's hard to differentiate between theory and a serious hypothesis, particularly when it comes from the mouth of a researcher or scientist. Listen carefully if and when they say, my theory is, and they have some evidence, then we can interpret it as a worthy and important hypothesis. With more evidence and more hypothesis testing using good data, then hypothesis can evolve into a theory deserving of some respect. In the most formal sense, theory or social theory, whether in the social sciences or natural sciences, is a well-developed explanatory framework based on accumulated evidence and open to review and critique by a community of scientists or social scientists. Lastly, in some areas, such as when astrophysicists theorize on what occurred a second before the Big Bang, even with all of their accumulated evidence, theory is still speculation. We can say that it becomes a very serious, very sophisticated, and evidence-based speculation or hypothesis. Unfortunately, we don't have a social theory that equals the Big Bang. At times, you'll find researchers using different metaphors and analogies for characterizing the importance of social theories in their field or discipline. And every one of these metaphors and analogies have advantages and they have shortcomings. My favorite analogy for theory is a high-powered lens intended to aid us in interpreting and understanding aspects of a phenomena that act together. Lens highlights sharp perception and the use of different lenses depending on what you're studying. But the analogy might suggest that all you need is a lens. The word lens doesn't include the highly trained scientists who are using the lens. Then there's theory as an analytical framework for organizing complex social realities into intelligible components and relations. Well, I like that analogy as well. The problem is that analytical framework sounds a bit static, a bit rigid, and still I like it. Next, there's social theories as conceptual maps. The map tells you where to go, directions useful in uncovering underlying mechanisms and structures within institutions, almost like finding hidden treasures in the field. Now, I really like conceptual maps, and I like the pirate image as well. I'm reminded of the movie The Matrix. It highlights the idea that people may think they see reality directly, but what's really happening is hidden. Thus, one needs a red pill to finally see behind the veil. Then there's an analytical shovel that enables you to dig deep, to go underground, to see what most people cannot see. The problem, again, is that it obscures the role of the highly trained researcher or scientist, the individual who has to interpret whatever has been dug up. When the researcher finds an important phenomenon, they have to analyze it, interpret it, and then open their interpretation to the critique appears in the field. These metaphors and analogies are helpful if we use them intelligently to guide our investigation. Okay, we've arrived at the point where I provide a suggested 10-step scaffold that can be used to build your theoretical framework. I want you to see this scaffold as fluid and flexible, rather than a scaffold that you absolutely must follow. The scaffold or outline here is not really about sequence. Rather, they are items that are usually included in a theoretical framework. Before I begin, there are two stages as you construct your theoretical framework. The first stage is when you prepare for the research you want to engage in. For doctoral students, this stage normally happens as they write their dissertation proposal. The second stage is when you are writing your manuscript, once your data analysis is complete. The 10-step scaffold I present here is for this latter stage. You are presenting your theoretical framework for the reader to the reader. Throughout this tutorial, I have tried to have you think about the reader as you write. There's a person at their desk at home or in the library. They're reading your article or your book or your dissertation. How are they feeling as they read? How do you want them to feel? What is happening to the neurons in their brain? When you write, you are communicating with that person. You are speaking to them. You are reaching out to them with the fruit of your work, with your scholarly interpretation of your empirical findings. Okay, now with the 10-step scaffold for building your theoretical framework. You'll see that I have a number of colleagues and doctoral students to help me with this slide. All right, let's start with step one. What is the social phenomena you studied? Why was it important to study? For example, why first-generation immigrant students struggle to access institutional support. Why racial disparities persist in school discipline. Step 2. Briefly explain how prior research has explained this phenomenon. This is where you summarize dominant explanations. For example, the problem may have been studied using a status attainment functionalist model that explains why middle class students have higher aspirations and expectations for getting a college degree and entering the professions. It might be a research study that you found useful, but you see gaps. For example, research using James Coleman's theory of closure highlights how tightly knit communities help children succeed academically. You find the research helpful, but there's something that you see lacking. These are just examples that I pull from my own early research. The point is to inform the reader about the theoretical conversation you are entering. In a way, you are identifying the theorists and researchers in an imaginary conference room and pointing at how they have approached the problem you are studying. In step 3, you identify the limitations, gaps, or blind spots in prior explanations. You get tough. You step in with an authoritative voice. It's time for critique. Maybe prior studies you've identified lack attention to race, class, or gender structures. Studies that have utilized James Coleman's theory of closure ignore the advantages middle-class families have in creating closure between school, family, and community. You know that middle-class and affluent families are more likely to possess professional networks, are more likely to have this spare time to engage schools, and you know the way they're able to engage school personnel as peers. In step 4, you identify the broad intellectual tradition or paradigm used in your study. What worldview informs your analysis? Is your study rooted in critical race theory, or is it rooted in a neo-Marxist framework? Is it critical realism or social network theory? For step 5, you identify the specific theorists and the theory related to them. Is it Pierre Bourdieu and his theory of cultural capital? Is it Kimberly Crenshaw and her theory of intersectionality? Is it Richard Delgado's work on critical race theory? In step 6, you introduce the major constructs and concepts used in your study. For example, if you use Pierre Bourdieu's theory, you would introduce the constructs of capital, field, and habitus. If you use the work of Mark Granovetter, you'd introduce the construct of weak ties. All right, in step 7, you explain how these constructs relate to each other. How do these constructs interact? How do social class and habitus interact? Does one construct produce the other? In step 8, you explain why this theory is important to your study. Why is this theory better than others used to explain the same phenomena? In step 9, you apply the theory to your specific study. For example, if your study is on undocumented students using social capital theory, you'd show how this theory, combined with the construct of institutional agents, help explain how relationships with school personnel shape access to college-going resources. Finally, in step 10, you state your theoretical proposition. That is, your preface argument. This is where your own contribution comes in. There are multiple ways to state your preface argument. I offer only one example here. Quote, all right, quote. Based on my empirical findings and guided by my theoretical framework, I argue that, etc., etc. In this next section, I want to walk you through 6 major approaches to planning and advancing an investigation. I'll do this by highlighting 6 core dimensions that can help you understand each approach. I know, 6 and then followed by 6 again can be confusing. So it's 6 major approaches and 6 core dimensions to almost every research study. And just to be clear, there are certainly more than 6 approaches to research. My goal here is not to be exhaustive. My goal is to show you how different research approaches can be evaluated using a common framework. You'll recognize this framework in terms of research, design, and methodology. I'm using the dimensions framework because I want to include and highlight theoretical framework and type of argument. After we contrast these 6 approaches, I'll also share examples of real research studies. All right, let's begin with the 6 dimensions. The first dimension is research design. What is the overall logic of explanation? How will you, the researcher, move from research question to hypothesis to evidence to argument? Examples are deductive design, inductive design, emergent design, theory-guided qualitative design, and comparative case study. The second dimension is methodology. What is the broader philosophical approach? How do you believe knowledge is best produced, at least for the study you intend to pursue? Examples are qualitative methodology, quantitative methodology, interpretive methodology, or ethnographic methodology. The third dimension involves whether your study is primarily driven by research questions or by hypotheses that are stated upfront and then tested. If your study is driven by hypotheses, then you are following a deductive research design. If your study is motivated by research questions, then you are following either an inductive design or a theory-guided qualitative design. The fourth dimension is methods. How is the data to be collected? How is it going to be analyzed? With regard to data collection, you may plan to use surveys, interviews, participant observations, ethnography, or statistical measures. If you are engaging in content analysis, use interviews, open-ended questions, or other methods. With regard to data analysis, do you plan to use inductive analyses or theory-guided qualitative analysis with possible abductive analysis? If you're pursuing a statistical study, of course, you're using statistical analysis. As you know, many researchers use mixed or multiple methods in one study. Now, don't get methods confused with methodology. They are different dimensions in this framework. Our attention here to methods has to include the qualitative strategy of what's called emergent design. It's a flexible approach to data collection and analysis. As a researcher learns more from the field and the incoming data, they allow aspects of the study to change. This may include modifying interview questions, changing sampling strategies, pursuing unexpected themes, refining concepts, and shifting analytic focus. The design emerges during the study. Emergent design is common in many forms of qualitative fieldwork, including ethnography, interpretive sociology, case studies, and grounded theory. The fifth dimension concerns the role of a theoretical framework. Will you begin your study with a clearly defined theoretical framework, or do you expect the theory or a theoretical interpretation will emerge and evolve during your study? In this latter case, you are probably following an emergent design. And the sixth dimension asks what kind of argument your study ultimately produces. Do you end with an empirical argument, one that identifies important patterns in the data without relying on existing theory, or do you arrive at a theoretical argument, a deeper theoretical interpretation of your empirical findings? Okay, let's review these six dimensions. 1. Research design. 2. Methodology. 3. Research questions or hypotheses. 4. Methods, including emergent design. 5. Theoretical framework. 6. An empirical argument or theoretical argument. Now, once you understand these six dimensions, it becomes much easier to understand the logic behind very different research studies. Before outlining the six approaches to planning and advancing a research study, I want to briefly pause and address two important aspects of the research and writing process. The first is the classic role of research studies in sociology and the broader social sciences. And the second is positionality statement that many scholars now include in their published manuscripts. All right, let's begin with research studies, with research questions. Research questions help structure the planning phase of a study around specific and focused inquiries. At their core, research questions are driven by curiosity. They reflect a desire to understand, interpret, and explain social phenomena. They also help determine what data you collect, what cases you study, and what methods you use, whether that be interviews, surveys, archival materials, ethnographic observation, and so forth. Now let's look at 4 common forms that research questions often take. The first form is descriptive. Here, the researcher is trying to establish social patterns, social structures, and the lived experiences of the people or communities being studied. These questions often sound like the following. What is happening here? Why is this important to the people involved? Why should social scientists pay attention to this phenomenon? How can I accurately interpret what I'm observing? The second form is interpretive. These questions focus on meaning. They ask how people make sense of their world. For example, how do people attach meaning to a particular social practice? How do people interpret their identities, relationships, or institutional experiences? The third form is structural. These questions examine how institutions, organizations, social structures, and networks shape relationships and outcomes. For example, how do social structures organize opportunities? How do networks distribute resources? How do institutions reproduce social inequality? The fourth form focuses on factors that appear to contribute to a particular outcome of interest. These questions often explore associations or possible causal relationships, although they may not formally establish causality. In these studies, researchers may ask, what factors appear to contribute to this outcome? Why do some individuals experience this outcome while others do not? These questions often move researchers closer to causal explanations, but without necessarily making strong causal claims. Okay, let me now briefly address the importance of the positionality statement when introducing your research study in a published manuscript. Positionality refers to a researcher making explicit their social, institutional, and intellectual location within society. This often includes reflecting on one's position in relation to social class, race, gender, and other forms of social hierarchy. We can also use the concept of intersectionality a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. And the purpose is important. Researchers do this to help readers understand how their social location may have shaped the questions they ask, the data they prioritize, the way they interpreted that data, and ultimately the claims they now make. As I emphasized earlier in this tutorial, data do not interpret themselves. Interpretation is always mediated by the researcher's training, their assumptions, epistemological commitments, and lived experiences. The same is true for the research questions that motivate a study. And the same is true for the theories that scholars choose to guide their work. A positionality statement is ultimately a practice of transparency. It allows readers to better understand how a researcher's social and intellectual location may shape interpretation, without undermining methodological rigor and without weakening the validity of the study. In fact, I would argue that this kind of transparency often strengthens scholarly rigor. I remember very clearly my own graduate school years during the 1980s. At the time, positionality statements were virtually non-existent in the research literature, and yet the positionality of many authors often felt very visible to me, particularly in sociology and certainly in psychology. They're often both tacit and sometimes explicit assumptions that findings and theoretical frameworks were universally applicable to everyone, regardless of race, social class, or gender. Researchers almost never identified themselves as white men. That identity position was often treated as neutral, universal, and invisible. I also remember women in psychology being very outspoken about the gender bias embedded in many psychological theories. And in education, faculty of color increasingly challenged theoretical frameworks that portrayed students of color through a deficit-oriented lens, often suggesting that these students lacked proper cultural or linguistic resources. In the years that followed, we witnessed an extraordinary wave of scholarship from researchers of color. These scholars challenged, revised, and in many cases dismantled deficit-oriented frameworks. They also did something equally important. They demonstrated that rigorous research on communities of color could be both deeply critical and methodologically sophisticated. In the next video, part 5 of this series, I will take you through the 6 major approaches to planning and advancing an investigation. It is the last video of this series. I will see you there.